Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff.
As soon as the pilot utters those words, you completely submit yourself to them. You know for a fact that you're in their hands, literally and figuratively. When the captain of that flight uttered, "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff" from Kathmandu Airport's tarmac, the 178 passengers must have felt the same anxiety and excitement. They must have wanted to walk. But they did not. Of those 178 passengers, 5 were terrorists committed to hijacking this Airbus A300. This is the story of the airplane that never landed in New Delhi. This is the story of the Kandahar hijacking. Chapter 1 Kathmandu. Captain Devi Sharan was looking forward to spending the final Christmas of that millennium with his wife and kids. But one round trip from Delhi to Kathmandu and back stood in his way. Devi Sharan was a pilot for Indian Airlines and captain of flight IC 813 or 814. You see, while flying from Delhi to Kathmandu, the flight code was 813, and upon return to Delhi, it was 814. It was 2 p.m., December 24th, 1999. This 248-seater Airbus A300 soared over the Himalayas into Nepalese airspace. The pilot marveled at the view. What a privilege to glide this bird through this, the 37-year-old Captain Sharan thought. Alas, he owed his 10 and 7-year-old daughters a lot of gift from Nepal's Tribhuvan International Airport's duty-free. Alongside him were co-pilot Rajinder Kumar and flight engineer Anil Jagia. They often flew together, these three, and knew each other quite well. The camaraderie in a cockpit, they say, is unmatched. The men didn't say it out loud, but each saw in the other's eye a desire to be back in New Delhi with their family. Like Devi, Anil too had 2 daughters, Anupama and Aparna. He had told his wife Kusum to install a Santa Claus beside the Christmas tree his elder daughter had been decorating. Quote, "Your operations must realize that you too have a family, and we also look forward to family get-togethers," Kusum retorted. As he waved her goodbye, neither wife nor husband knew that it might be the last time they would ever see each other. As he was going, Anil Jagia's mom added, "Beta, please check your aircraft properly." For decades his mom told him this, her way of bidding her son safe passage. The sage advice, however, presaged a looming disaster. In Kathmandu, meanwhile, at 12:30 p.m. on that day, Anup Sharma had reached the Tribhuvan airport hours before the scheduled departure in typical Desi manner. Originally from Bihar, Anup was in Kathmandu for a business trip. He was headed to Bombay, where he now lived with his family. He was in a hurry, you see, like every passenger, to get back before Christmas. But his wasn't a direct flight to Bombay. He had a layover in Delhi, for which he was set to board flight IC 814. Anup frequented Kathmandu for work. He was a regular at this airport. But on that day, things felt a little different. After getting his boarding pass, he made a customary call to his wife. Quote, "After making the phone call, I approached the immigration authority and was surprised to see his behavior. The person sitting did not see my passport or driving license to verify my identity. He did not even look towards me and stamp my immigration form. Further, while passing through security, there was no security personnel to frisk the passengers, and their metal detector was also not working. Not only this, when my cabin baggage was passing through X-ray machine, the security personnel sitting there was not looking at the monitor. Rather, he was talking to one of his colleagues. After my boarding card was stamped by a lady security personnel, I asked her to stamp on my cabin baggage tag, which is a normal procedure, and she told me that it is not required. I have been to Kathmandu many times, but I have never seen such kind of security lapses during any of my earlier visits. Whole departure lounge was looking like a fish market. Anybody could go in and out of the lounge." End quote. Such glaring gaps in security at an airport are unheard of. Would the events of 24th December 1999 been shaped differently had the authorities at Tribhuvan International Airport done their duties diligently? Or had destiny made up its mind?
Aran, I don't know if you'll address this later, but was this just a lapse for no other reason other than the workers that day simply had too much else on their mind? Or what was going wrong? That's not normal at all.
Ishwara, it's not normal at all, and I've read several testimonies about that day being particularly lax in the security. I don't know, it didn't seem to be a conspiracy or anything. I think it just happened to be Christmas Eve.
Sure.
And holiday times, and it was just a coming together of many variables that led to that instead of a larger conspiracy. But it did seem like that particular day, that particular part of the season, the security forces did be a little more lax than usual.
How odd.
In fact, to your point, Ashwara, Kolatu Ravi Kumar was another passenger due for the same flight. The 41-year-old was a former merchant navy captain, now working for a US-based company. He had made a quick solo leisure trip to Kathmandu, but a few days into his trip in the country of the Everest, he resolved to get back to his wife and kids for Christmas. Initially, he planned on driving down to Delhi, but as fate would have it, he eventually bought a ticket. A ticket to hell. Quote, I had planned to drive down to Delhi from Kathmandu, but I was tired and did not want to sit in a car for 36 hours. Thus, on December 22nd morning, I went to the Indian Airlines office in Kathmandu to book a ticket. I got a ticket, but it was waitlisted at 13. Unlucky number, I thought. But the IA reservation counter said the ticket would be confirmed by the evening. I inquired in the evening and the ticket was waitlisted 4. On December 23rd, the ticket was confirmed. Ravi Kumar reached the airport at 11:30 a.m. that day. He'd have to spend 4 hours in the airport because the flight had been delayed by 3 hours. Much like Anup though, he was surprised at the lack of diligence at what was an international airport. Quote, the Delhi flight arrived around 3:45 p.m. and we were rushed through security. I went through the metal detector, but it did not react to my keys or the belt buckle. Perhaps it is not working, I thought. End quote. Once the plane landed in Kathmandu and the passengers deboarded, co-pilot Rajinder Kumar sought permission from air traffic control to fly back, henceforth referred to as ATC. Now the flight code changed from IC 813 to IC 814 inbound to New Delhi. Back in the cockpit of this aircraft, Captain Devi Sharan, co-pilot Rajinder Kumar, and flight engineer Anil Jagia were running the final checks. By 4 p.m., all 178 passengers had boarded the flight. Apart from the pilots, the cabin crew included Senior Cabin Manager Anil Sharma, Junior Cabin Manager M.A. Satesh, and air hostesses Sabita Khalko, Kobita Mukherjee, Rajani Chandrasekhar, Tara Debnath, Sapna Menon, and Kalpana Majumdar. With the boring yet imperative seatbelt and safety announcements complete, the flight was set to take off. However, the calamity that awaited them was not included in the safety demonstrations. There was no training or textbook available for what was about to happen to IC 814.
Clear to start number 2. Starting engine number 2. Clear number 1.
Starting 1.
Both engines stabilized. Pushback completed and tractor disconnected. Good day.
814 ready to taxi.
814 clear to taxi to runway 20.
814 ready for departure.
814 surface wind is light and variable. Clear for takeoff.
814 clear for takeoff.
Power set. Check 100 knots.
Checked.
V1 rotate.
The aircraft was airbound, soaring past the Nepalese border town of Bhairava. The cockpit relaxed, enjoyed the view, and chatted away. Captain Sharan complained about the late departure from Delhi airport, wishing it was on time so he could spend more time with his family. As the three men talked fondly of their family, the intercom buzzed at 4:38 p.m. It was Senior Cabin Manager Anil Sharma, a polite and diplomatic man as described by his peers. He called to inform that he was bringing tea and coffee for them. He knocked on the door, and flight engineer Jagia got up to open the door for refreshments. At the same time, at 4:39, the aircraft entered Indian airspace. The co-pilot made a joke about the niceness of Hyderabadi people, and all laughed. That's the final time they'd laugh in a long, long time. Because just a few seconds later, a man barged into the cockpit. Anil Sharma tried pushing the door to prevent this man who was wearing a red balaclava as a mask, but failed. All you could see through his monkey cap were his eyes, which too were disguised using monochromatic lenses. This 5'3" intruder had the cockpit frozen. Shit! What is this? Devi Sharan protested. He thought it was some kind of a Christmas joke, but it wasn't. कोई होशियारी नहीं करेगा, कोई हिलेगा नहीं, तैयारा हमारे कब्जे में है. Nobody move or try to act smart. We have seized the aircraft. This was the chief hijacker, code-named Redcap. The real names of the hijackers were only discovered by intelligence forces much later. His real name was Ibrahim Attar. To the shell-shocked pilots, he will forever be Redcap. Redcap said, quote, "Don't do anything. Don't say anything. Just fly this plane towards the west." In 1999, the Indian Airlines did not have an anti-hijacking manual for its pilots. Whatever they had to do, whatever they ended up doing, was a function of their instinct and their intelligence. It was 3 versus 1. You think, why didn't they just overpower this hijacker? That had to do with the revolver in his left hand and a grenade in his right. The hijackers were armed. He held his gun to Captain Sharan's head and asked where the air guards were seated. The captain said there were no air guards on this flight. Redcap was unconvinced. Quote, "Call your air guards now," he blurted. Jagia recalls the hijacker's voice sounding similar to that of the Pakistani taxi drivers he often met in Sharjah. When the captain was trying to explain to Redcap that air guards are an American thing, another man entered the cockpit. This one wore a black balaclava. His alias was Burger, real name Qazi Sunny Ahmed. The gravity of the situation sunk in. So did the helplessness. Captain Sharan complied and flew westward.
Aryan, this picture you're painting just makes me feel so fortunate that we're born in the time we're born in. To think of a man entering an airport with a grenade and a revolver is just, it's so unheard of to our sensibilities. And yeah, I just feel like we're all so fortunate to be born in a time where security is so much different than this.
We forget that air travel was different pre-2001 versus post-2001. Just a completely different world.
Yep.
But you see, Ashwara, things were still calm in the cabin at this point. The crew had just wound up liquor service and was serving food. Kolatu Ravi Kumar was sitting on seat 29B. He was awaiting his meal when a man in a monkey cap came from the business class section flailing a gun and a grenade. "Don't move. Plane hijack ho gaya hai. The plane has been hijacked." The former merchant navy man thought this was a prank. The passenger beside him muttered that it was a mock exercise. Quote, "I felt nervous, but suddenly remembered a Hollywood movie that I had seen years ago. In it, there was a scene in which an airline conducts a mock exercise to gauge the travelers' reactions. Oh, the Indian Airlines is also doing a mock rehearsal." Anup Sharma, sitting on 7G, the first row in economy, thought the same thing. He saw 3 masked men armed with knives, revolvers and grenades. They shouted the plane was hijacked, told the passengers to put their hands to their knees and not look around, else they'd be killed. It was such an unreal situation that Anup earnestly believed that this was a Christmas prank. Disobeying the orders, he looked at the air hostess in front of him and asked her. She nodded. One of the hijackers saw this. He flung Anup's half-eaten tray and hit him with the butt of the gun. Most passengers were in a similar state of mind, surprised and numb. They didn't follow the hijacker's orders not out of defiance but sheer shock. One by one, the hijackers slapped the passengers into submission. Ravi Kumar and Anup's wishful thinking that this is a prank was assuaged when Captain Devi Sharan came on the PA system.
"Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain D. Sharan. Our plane has been hijacked. You must be patient and listen to the hijackers."
In normal circumstances, the pilot's constant redundant updates on the PA system are like the security guard beating his cane at midnight. Pointless and reassuring. So was this one. IC 814 and its passengers were merely 1 hour away from home, from the safety of their land. But this flight would never touch the tarmac at Indira Gandhi International Airport. Chapter 2, New Delhi. In the cockpit, Captain Sharan stared blankly at the view he often cherished. He was hyper-aware of his surroundings, but he couldn't talk to his mates, couldn't discuss and deliberate an emergency plan. He had to think. He knew that somehow he needed to inform ATC that they had been hijacked. Currently, they were flying over Uttar Pradesh, and he was connected to Varanasi ATC. While Redcap and Burger looked away, Devi sent a coded message. He set his air traffic control transponder to 7500 MHz, the hijacking code. It is an instrument that transmits the height, position and direction of the aircraft. Quote, when it is set at 7,500 megahertz, the ground control comes to know that the plane has been hijacked. In a matter of seconds, this information would be conveyed to all civil aviation authorities in India. They could then track the aircraft to see where it was going and at what height it was flying. End quote. Redcap caught heed of this. Aapne button daba diya. Have you pressed the emergency button? He asked. Don't try to be brave. I'll shoot you if you do. You fly the plane. If you want to do anything else, ask for my permission. End quote. Unbeknownst to the hijackers, Captain Sharan also slowed down the plane by 30% from 320 to 250 knots in order to give the ground authorities time to figure out the next steps. By now, Lucknow ATC had transferred the message of the hijacking to the primary ATC at New Delhi, where Director General of Civil Aviation H.S. Khola was alerted. The first prominent official to be made aware of the hijacking was Civil Aviation Secretary Ravindra Gupta, and thus the domino of chain of command unfurled. The message spread through the government and authorities. A flight flying from Kathmandu has been hijacked. But little did anyone know that an unbelievable coincidence was taking place in the sky at the same time. Merely 4 minutes away from IC-814 was a VVIP airplane, flying in the same trajectory. The aircraft belonged to India's head of government, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He was returning from a public meeting in Bihar alongside Union Civil Aviation Minister Sharad Yadav. The Prime Minister was expecting a jubilant welcome by his cabinet and friends. 25th December, Christmas, after all, is his birthday. But this birthday would be marked by a surprise he wished he never got. When he landed, he was briefed about the hijacking. But I wonder, what would the hijackers have done had they known they were in striking distance of the Prime Minister?
Aryan, at this point, do we have any information about why the hijackers picked the specific plane they picked? Was it just a random pick out of the many flights flying to India or out of Kathmandu? Or was there a specific reason for this?
It was, again, a culmination of the holiday season where security forces are in general lax. I mean, if you ever see, Aishwarya, the trend of when gold heists happen, they're the most during Christmas and New Year's across history.
Okay.
Because that's the, time folks are the least vigilant. The other reason, of course, to pick the Kathmandu flight was because the terrorists had been scoping that for a long time, for months in fact. This was hatched in June of that year, this plan. But why this flight? I think it's a function of sheer probability. It had nothing to do with the fact that the Prime Minister was 4 minutes away. It boggles my mind that this was happening. Yeah. The Ministry of Civil Aviation had framed a comprehensive contingency plan for a hijacking scenario. It had even updated it in 1995 to include more provisions. But this plan had never been tested. It had never been put through the ringer of reality. Under the revised contingency plan, the Crisis Management Group, or CMG, in Delhi, assisted by a central committee that functions from the ATC building at Indira Gandhi International Airport, is in charge of dealing with the hijacking. Basically, that tall tower you see while dropping off your loved one at the terminal, that building becomes ground zero of dealing with the crisis. It is headed by the Cabinet Secretary, who in this case was Prabhat Kumar. On that day, the tower at Delhi's Indira Gandhi Airport was conferred that thankless task. The pilots kept flying westward. But they couldn't continue this for long. They needed a destination to enter into the computer system, so they didn't crash into another plane on the same route. But the hijackers refused to name one. Redcap knew that eventually he would have to give a name because the craft only had so much fuel. They'd need to refuel somewhere. He asked what's the farthest city the plane could fly. Captain Sharan said Delhi, Amritsar, or back to Lucknow. This angered Redcap. He barked, Lahore. The hijackers wanted to go to Pakistan. The pilots knew that would dismiss any hope of a rescue. Pakistan-India tensions were at an all-time high in 1999. The cauldrons underneath were boiling. A Kargil war was on the cusp. Lahore wasn't an option, they thought. Against his wishes, the captain fed the coordinates, but they still needed to inform ATC so they could avoid crashing with another plane. At this thought, the hijackers rebuked sarcastically. That would be good. Engineer Jagya clapped back. Then who in the world will know that this flight has been hijacked? Everyone will say two aircrafts hit each other and all your efforts will go to waste. End quote. That logic appealed to the chief hijacker. He conceded his hostage's demand. According to the book The Inside Story, quote, the message was relayed.
We see 814 is being hijacked.
Varanasi ATC came on the line immediately.
Request endurance on board.
814 responded.
Have endurance 3 hours.
ATC Varanasi checked.
Understand destination Delhi.
Destination Delhi.
814 confirmed.
Asking for Lahore.
Asking for Lahore. Now that wasn't an easy task for the CMG in New Delhi. Getting permission for a hijacked commercial airliner from your country to enter an enemy's country is not a small ask. It's not a respectable ask either. It's a humanitarian ask. New Delhi had to put its ego aside as it made calls to its diplomatic counterparts in Islamabad to acquaint them with what had happened. Everyone awaited what Lahore ATC had to say. The pilots, 30,000 feet in the air, awaited as desperately as the CMG at Delhi airport. Minutes later, the line in the cockpit is active. Lahore refused to accept the flight. Confirm, Lahore refused to accept the flight.
No way.
Still, the hijackers didn't budge. It was Lahore or die in a crash when the fuel runs out, but not India. As this is happening, a nearby aircraft had heard their plea and joined their channel. It was IC 849 being piloted by RN Singh, a senior man at Indian Airlines. Everyone knew him as RN.
RN here, what is the problem?
We have been hijacked, sir, and they have everything. Grenades, revolver, AK-47, everything.
Be cool and just follow what they say and confirm they boarded at Kathmandu.
Affirm, sir.
They want to go where? Lahore?
Affirm, sir.
Just be cool and do what they say and everything should be alright.
Thank you, sir.
With only an hour and a half of fuel remaining, the pilots needed to begin descent somewhere, and Lahore still hadn't approved their request. In fact, the Pakistanis had closed off their airspace entirely, so much so that they did not even let their Pakistan International Airlines PIA flight land. To make matters worse, the Pakistani government in Islamabad threatened to shoot down the aircraft if it entered Pakistani airspace. Captain Devi Sharan begged on radio that they have a gun to their head and passengers are being threatened by execution. They kept flying around Amritsar at the edge of the Pakistani border when suddenly their radio crackled. This time, it was not ATC New Delhi. It was ATC Lahore. IC 814 had pinged the Pakistani radar. The message came, "You cannot enter Pakistan airspace. You will be shot down." Loud and clear for everyone to hear. The plane now had 40 minutes of fuel. It was on the verge of crashing into the fields of Punjab. Captain Sharan changed his ploy. He promised to fly the hijackers wherever they wanted if only they let him refuel. He ensured them that the refueling would happen in mere minutes and that the moment the aircraft had been pumped, he will take off without wasting a second. Again, the hijacker conceded to the hostage. ATC Amritsar was online. The plane began its descent. It touched down at 7 p.m. But Captain Devi Sharan was soon about to find out that his promise to Red Cap was going to be broken, because IC 814 stood on the tarmac until 8 p.m. and no oil bowser ever showed up.
Oh my god.
Chapter 3 Amritsar. The plane came to a screeching halt on the runway 34 of Raja Sansi Airport. As soon as it touched down, the hijacker wanted the pilot to brake. The captain explained that it's impossible because the plane would literally flip over. The hijacker relented, but the captain didn't budge under gunpoint because he knew if he'd brake, they'd all die anyway. Perhaps Red Cap was scared of death after all because he let Devi Sharan live, at least for now. The solitary Airbus occupied the runway, but the hijacker's directions, it went up and down the tarmac. It was never allowed to be stationary, lest an anti-hijacking attack be mounted by the Indian forces. The hijackers were clearly trained and knew what they were doing. Red Cap and Berger regularly glanced out from the cockpit window to check for any commando sneaking up the tires. Captain Devi Sharan was relentless in asking ATC Amritsar to send the refueling oil bowser. "It's on its way," the controller responded. 5 minutes passed, but nothing seemed to be on its way. 5 became 15, and the hijackers were fuming. They accused the captain of lying, threatened to kill him, threatened to blow the plane up. Each time the nozzle of the gun was girded in his skull by Red Cap, the captain pleaded the ATC to send the bowser faster. Each time the bowser was on its way, quote unquote. But you can't blame the controller for this delay. Those were the direct orders. The man of the hour in Amritsar at the helm of this small airport was District Magistrate Narinderjeet Singh. He was accompanied by intelligence officers when the red alert was sounded across the city. DM Narinderjeet had clear instructions from New Delhi. Quote, "We need about an hour and a half to mount a commando operation," end quote. They would have to stall the hijackers. While the oil bowser was actually readily available, Devi Sharan's cries were deliberately ignored so they could get time. India's best chance to mount a counterattack was on Indian soil. This was a bet they were willing to take. First, the hijackers were informed that the nearby Indian oil field was closed and opening it had caused the delay. Then they were told the bowser is on its way, but it is facing some issues. The ATC was eking out seconds while Devi Sharan was counting them on his fingertips. He knew he didn't have many left at this rate. During this time, a weird thing happened. At 7:20 pm, ATC Amritsar received a mysterious call from the Home Ministry. The man claimed to be a certain J. Lal and ordered the plane to be refueled and let go. Because the airport was taking instructions only from the CMG, they did not accept this order. But later investigation by the CBI revealed that there was no J. Lal. This anonymous call was made from a phone registered to a woman speculated to originate from Europe. Clearly something larger was at play. Meanwhile, between Bowser updates, the controller was trying to subtly get information about the hijackers. Already in communicating the hijackers' demand to ATC, Captain Sharan pulled off a masterstroke. He sent a coded message. Hotel India Juliet 5. HIJ5, as in 5 hijackers. Redcap, Burger, Doctor, Shankar, and Bhola. The hijackers weren't oblivious to these delay tactics. They'd been trained to expect it. The threats on the passengers' lives kept mounting. Redcap told the captain to tell ATC that if the bowser doesn't appear in 2 minutes, the executions will begin. There was a resolve in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. He pulled up his gun to Captain Sharan's head and cocked it. 30, 29, 28. He began a countdown. At 1, he promised to blow Captain Sharan's head unless he took off. Flight engineer Anil Jagia was very close to the captain. The sight of him at death's mercy was too much for him to handle. He recalls, quote, "I couldn't see my captain and friend being shot in front of my eyes. I fell at Redcap's feet and said, 'Please stop. Don't do this.' And since the hijacker was a short man, I raised my hand and cupped it over his mouth to stop the dreadful countdown. My action took the hijacker completely by surprise. This was totally unexpected from a hostage. He hit my hand hard with the butt of the revolver. My arm hit the fire extinguisher handle on the ceiling of the cockpit. 'You talk too much,' the hijacker shouted. 'Main tumhe dekhta hoon. I will settle with you.' Moving away from Captain Sharan, he put the revolver to my head. 'I'll count down in the reverse order from 30 and then I'll shoot at 1. Take off now.' The cabin wasn't any less terrorized. Of the 5 hijackers, 3 menaced the civilians. 8 passengers were chosen to be brought into business class and tied. These were all well-built men that the terrorists feared could mount an overthrow. Of these 8 was 25-year-old Rupan Katyal, who was returning from his honeymoon. Upon being pulled out from his seat, away from his wife Rachna, tore him apart. His 20-year-old bride remained alone in economy. He would never see her again. Merchant Navy Captain Ravi Kumar was just saved from being pulled out. His new haircut drew the hijackers' suspicions. They asked if he worked in the intelligence services. He convinced them that he was a civilian. But for the remainder of the hijacking, Ravi Kumar would maintain exhaustive notes about the landing and takeoff times and other key details from a pen in his pocket. When Rupan was dragged into business class, blindfolded and cuffed, he couldn't help but raise his head to see if Rachna was fine. He disobeyed the hijackers on 3 occasions. The hijacker named Doctor, real name Shahid Sayyid Akhtar, had had enough. Satnam Singh was one of the 8 men in business class and he sat beside Rupan. He recalls, quote, "It was all very sudden. Doctor was standing near me and stabbed me 4 times just under my chin, twice on my cheeks and once in my neck. I fell down, but I saw them catch hold of Rupan Katyal and stab him in the neck. That's when I fainted." End quote. Rupan and Satnam lay there, bleeding profusely. In the cockpit, that countdown drew towards 1. The gun was squarely facing Anil Jagya's temples. Suddenly, Captain Sharan saw the oil bowser on the runway. The countdown slowed down. It was in fact an Indian oil refueling bowser speeding towards the aircraft. The hijackers panicked. They felt that this was a covert operation. And they were right. Hidden inside the tanker were anti-hijacking commandos. Captain relayed this to ATC, asking them to slow down, but instead of gradually slowing down, the bowser halted suddenly, further alarming the hijackers. They knew the jig was up. The countdown resumed, faster this time. 5, 4, 3, 2, and Devi Sharan pushed the gears ahead. At 7:49 p.m., Captain Sharan shouted, "We are taking off." According to the transcript by the airport director at Amritsar, the radio operators could hear people crying in the background. Quote, "We are taking off. We are all dying now. No bow, sir. We are heading towards Lahore. IC 814 has no fuel. You inform Lahore about this. We have no fuel. They have already killed 4 passengers. It is confirmed. You did not understand. They only wanted to refuel." End quote.
Aryan, this breaks my heart so much. This was so close.
So close.
So close to either them being saved or so close to the aircraft being refueled. And there was such a long window of opportunity. And obviously, I don't know what the on-ground realities were, but this just breaks my heart.
The Airbus A300 roared on the runway. The captain wasn't willing to risk his friend's life. Just 500 meters away from him on the runway stood that very same oil bowser. The aircraft was heading right in its direction. Under standard conditions, the aircraft requires 2,000 to 3,000 meters of runway. Captain Sharan only had 500 meters, a quarter of the distance. From the ATC tower, DM Naninderjeet watched IC-814 about to crash into the Indian oil tanker. An explosion was inevitable until the last second when Captain Sharan pulled back and the fuselage of the aircraft whistled past the bowser, avoiding an imminent death. IC-814 took off for a second time, this time with only 25 minutes of fuel. Chapter 4. Lahore. The tension was palpable at 7 Racecourse, the Prime Minister's residence. Vajpayee was disappointed that the flight was allowed to take off from Amritsar. That might have been their best shot at a peaceful solution. He sought counsel from his cabinet, led by Home Minister L.K. Advani and External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh. These were senior members that the PM trusted. Vajpayee appointed Jaswant Singh to supervise operations and keep him apprised of developments, while Advani was told to go to the CMG, the Crisis Management Group, to oversee that. Jaswant Singh had another crucial job, to be in comms with the Americans. India's only quasi-friend that could influence Pakistan and other Middle Eastern members in 1999 was America. The Americans had also been working with the Indian intelligence agencies RAW and the Intelligence Bureau, the IB, to share information on the attackers. What was happening in the sky and on ground were two completely different stories. IC-814 was on the fringes of the Pakistani border when their radio chirped, "Do not enter Pakistan. You will be shot down if you enter our airspace." This wasn't a bluff, especially in light of the Indian Air Force shooting down a Pakistan Air Force PC-3 Orion naval reconnaissance aircraft with 16 men on board over the run-off Kutch in Gujarat just recently. The Pakistanis had been yearning for revenge. Could this be that moment? Captain Sharan begged the Pakistani controller, "We have guns to our heads. Please allow us to come in. Repeat, please allow us to come in." IC-814 crossed into the enemy's airspace unharmed. While they didn't shoot the plane, ATC Lahore informed them that the runway was blocked, approach lights turned off, and radio aids like VOR and ADF and ILS being turned off. Landing was out of the question. But to the satisfaction of everyone in the cockpit, as they approached Lahore city, a lit airstrip was finally visible. The Pakistanis had finally seen the humanitarian side of this tragedy. Finally, the injured passengers Satnam and Rupan would get treatment that might give them a shot at surviving. The plane began its descent. They were on the verge of touching down, merely 300 feet from the ground, about the height of the Big Ben in London, when they realized that this strip of land wasn't an airstrip. Co-pilot Rajinder exclaimed, "Boss, ye to road hai. This is a road." Cars were zooming right below them and food stall flanked the road. The captain pulled back his steering, jutting the nose of the craft back into the air, barely escaping the pedestrians. Right after the near miss, ATC Lahore rang them up. "IC-814, we are switching on the lights. Come on the runway." End quote. Was it the near disaster or a change of heart or diplomatic pressure? We don't know. Regardless, the aircraft landed successfully on an actual airstrip. The hijackers were as antsy as ever. Briefly, they thought actually that it was an Indian airport and the whole thing had been a charade. It wasn't until the ATC sent a car and displayed its number plate that hijackers believed that they were in Lahore. Given the depleted fuel reserve, the engine started sputtering. The Pakistani authorities promptly sent an oil bowser. They seemed impatient to get the Indian aircraft off their soil. The pilots made a plea to the hijackers to at least release women, children, the old, sick, and injured passengers. And you won't believe it, their cries did not fall on deaf ears. Redcap agreed. "You can do that," he said. Elated, Captain Sharan dialed ATC Lahore to inform that some passengers were to be released for treatment. But what followed broke their heart as much as mine. "IC 814, you've got the fuel. Now go wherever you want to. We are not letting you offload anybody or anything here. You had promised you will take the fuel and go. Now you've got the fuel. You may go." Captain Sharan said, "We only want some injured and sick passengers to be offloaded. The hijackers have given us permission for this." There was no reply from ATC. Co-pilot Rajinder spoke next. "Sir, we have some passengers who have been badly injured. Please accept them." After a long pause, Lahore ATC announced,
814, you may start and go.
This was a vulgar deviation from international conventions and basic civility. Rupan Katyal was still alive at this stage. His wife in economy was praying for a husband, unaware that he was losing blood rapidly, unaware that if the Pakistanis didn't treat him, he would not make it. And they did not treat him. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, the situation is fraught. Vajpayee's cabinet did not get along with Pervez Musharraf's military dispensation in Islamabad. To ask them for favours and help was politically difficult, especially since New Delhi had an inkling that Pakistan's intelligence service ISI was involved in the hijacking. India's Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh picked up the phone and dialed his Pakistani counterpart Abdul Sattar in Islamabad. They talked twice that evening. The first time, the Pakistani foreign minister was very cooperative and he said he would do whatever was necessary. But he said that he would have to call Lahore from Islamabad in order to arrange things. Things took a stark turn on the second call. This time, Jaswant Singh thought he wasn't talking to the same man he just spoke to. Something shifted in Abdus's attitude. According to an insider in the Home Ministry, quote, "It was as if he had gotten orders not to cooperate with the Indian government," end quote. New Delhi sought America's aid in dealing with Pakistan. Washington, D.C. was celebrating the arrival of Christmas, but White House's South Asian bloc was far removed. For them, Christmas was an afterthought. A hijacking was underway. And unbeknownst to anyone except the crew of IC-814, there was an American on board the flight. In fact, there were in total 10 nationalities present in the passengers: Canadian, French, Greek, Japanese, Italian, etc. But most importantly, an American, Jean Moore. If the hijackers were to find out they had a bargaining tool against the Americans, the trajectory of the hijacking would become shrouded in further layers of complexity. So, at no point in the hijacking did the pilots or the crew let it be known that there was an American on board. Helping New Delhi and Washington, D.C. was a man named Strobe Talbot, US Deputy Secretary of State. He, among other White House officials such as the US Ambassador to Pakistan, played a crucial role as messengers between New Delhi and Islamabad. But their efforts didn't bear fruit initially. For example, the Indians urgently requested that their ambassador to Pakistan, G. Parthasarthi, was given a helicopter from Islamabad to Lahore so he could open a channel of communication to the cockpit, so at least one Indian could be there on ground zero. Pakistan granted India this wish, but delayed it. Finally, at 10:35 p.m., the Indian ambassador was granted a chopper and took off for Lahore. But the problem was, just 3 minutes ago, at 10:32 p.m., flight IC-814-2 had taken off. Destination unknown. Chapter 5, UAE. Pakistan's lack of cooperation wasn't the only issue facing New Delhi. The fact that the hijackers hadn't made their demands known yet kept everyone in the dark. What did they want? Were these aimless suicide bombers? Then why hadn't they blown up the plane yet? Clearly they had an objective. One that they kept to themselves, only revealing it to the pilots once they took off from Lahore. Quote, "We want to internationalize the Kashmir issue," Redcap declared. Captain Sharan knew it was going to be a long night. Once airborne, Redcap uttered the dreaded words, "Aap Kabul chale. Go to Kabul." The cockpit stared in disbelief. Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, was a rogue state. Taliban had come in power in 1996, and since then most countries had cut off relationships with the fundamentalist Talibanis. In fact, India was one of the first to express their indignation and disapproval for the theocratic overlords. Not only was Kabul a daunting diplomatic task, pilots Captain Sharan and Rajinder Kumar knew planes did not survive Afghani airspace. Weapons were more common than cactus in that arid war-stricken nation. From anti-aircraft missiles to sniper practice through the mountains' canopies, planes were persona non grata. During the Soviet occupation, in fact, any plane taking off and landing preemptively released flares and hot aluminium chaff just in case there was a missile inbound. Indian Airlines Flight IC-814 had passengers, not protection. Protesting wasn't a luxury Devi Sharan had. He flew the plane and touchdown to Kabul was slated for 11:30 p.m. when all of a sudden their radio pinged. It was ATC Kabul. They said they were closed for the night. A haphazard decision was made to fly to Dubai and Emirates in the UAE. For now, the cockpit heaved a sigh of relief. UAE is familiar territory. The pilots often fly that route. While the hijackers were huddled outside the cockpit, ATC Kabul rang again. Kabul still closed, but Kandahar was open, a remote airport in Afghanistan. The captain slowly turned down the volume of the speaker. He didn't want the hijackers to find out that Afghanistan was still an option. The plane was cruising on autopilot when the captain took a break. He had been flying far beyond the stipulated maximum duration. He needed the toilet. When he left the sanctuary of the cockpit, he witnessed the bloodied mess in the business class section. Satnam Singh and Rupan Katyal lay injured, both moaning in pain, both still alive. The 25-year-old Rupan Katyal kept saying, "Papa, pani, Papa, pani, water, water." When an air hostess brought some for them, the hijackers disallowed it. "Why don't you help this passenger?" the captain said. "He needs bandages. Give him some water at least." Bhola responded, "If you don't go inside, I'll shoot you." As the flight approached Dubai, they also denied this orphaned aircraft a safe landing. New Delhi knew American connections must be employed. India-UAE relations were nothing like they are today. The South Asian bloc at the White House implored Dubai to allow a safe landing, and finally permission was granted to land at a military base nearby, the Al Minad Airport. It was 1:32 a.m. Christmas was here, but no gifts in sight, no smiles or laughter. Who knew the sight of airplane food could be any sadder? Since this was a military airport, all three cockpit crew were hopeful of an NSG commando intervention, and New Delhi had already begun planning it. Al Minad Air Base seemed well prepared to receive this infected aircraft. None other than Crown Prince Sheikh Al Maktoum was there along with the chief of the UAE Federal Forces, Lieutenant General Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. Soon, the US Consul General reached there too. The base was cordoned off by the UAE security forces. But what is incredible is that when the Indian Consul General Ashok Mukherjee and Ambassador K.C. Singh reached the Air Force base, they were not allowed entry by the airport security.
If only the airport security had been this thoughtful and this prompt back when the hijackers were entering, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation.
I swear to God, Aishwarya. And you know, when Jaswant Singh called the Crown Prince to explain that Indian diplomats should be allowed, he was told that no one from outside was allowed to enter the Air Force base.
Sure.
Further, the idea of an anti-hijacking maneuver by NSG commandos was flat out denied by the Crown Prince. The ATC operator at Al Minad proved to be the only Christmas miracle for the pilots. A well-spoken, charismatic radio operator. Just the medicine the doctor ordered for Red Cap. This operator's name was Abdullah. "I'm Abdullah. Let me see what I can do for you." Captain Sharan and Jagia exchanged assuring glances. Abdullah was a friendly voice, battling for the pilots. A Bowser was eventually sent, and the hijackers kept their end of the promise by releasing the children, the women, the injured, and the dead. The newly wedded husband died in a pool of his own blood. Rupan Katyal's body was flung down a chute as 26 other lucky passengers exited, all of whom ridden with guilt of the ones they left behind. No one told Rachna of her husband's death. According to flight engineer Jagia, quote, "Our first lucky break came when Red Cap left us alone for a few moments for the first time since the hijack. It gave the three of us vital time to hatch a plot. We decided that during takeoff roll at about 120 knots, I would trigger a false engine fire warning that could be used to abort the takeoff. The speed would create a sufficiently reassuring roar, yet be slow enough for Captain Sharan to apply the thrust reversers and thus stop the huge airliner. End quote. Redcap was back on his tantrum to take off. Take off or I will kill you. Take off or I will kill you had become a mantra the pilots were accustomed to. This time, however, they were going to fake an alarm. If only it wasn't for Berger. He appeared to be the smartest and most cunning of the hijackers. He also seemed to know a lot about aviation. During takeoff, he stood between Captain Sharan and Jaggia, thereby obstructing their ability to pull off this trick. At 4:30 am IST, once again, flight IC 814 was airborne. Destination, Kabul. Chapter 6. Kandahar. The hijackers wanted to internationalize the Kashmir issue, so to say, but how exactly? Their exact demands still had not been aired. All everyone knew is that they were obsessed with landing in Afghanistan. Clearly, there was a plan. Something was waiting for them. But who? The Airbus A300 was slightly lighter now, having offloaded 27 passengers, unburdening them and the pilots. Abdullah got off the comms, wishing them goodbye. Captain Sharan sensed the possibility of a suicide mission. Throughout their halt at Al Minad, Redcap and Berger had expressed crashing into the sea, sort of as a final resort. Now back in the air, they resumed that line of conversation. Berger re-entered the cabin. How far is the sea from here? Why? I want to know. We don't fly over the sea, the captain lied. We flew over the sea when we came, Berger correctly responded. Yes, we did. We have to take a different route when we are flying back. To prove this, co-pilot Rajinder took out a Jeppesen air route map. Quote, "Look at this map. Where's the sea?" he asked. The sea was clearly there on the map. He just hoped Berger couldn't read maps. The thing was, at this point, they were actually over the sea. It just happened to be pitch black. As scary as concealing their fate to Kabul was, crashing in the sea was endgame. And their persistence paid off. Berger acquiesced. Not for long though. A new demand presented. How do you get below the cockpit? He asked. That was the first time they all realized these hijackers have come with more than guns and grenades. Most likely, there was a bomb stored away in the luggage section that they wanted retrieved. The airplane was cruising smoothly 20,000 feet in the air. Autopilot gave the crew a break. The hijackers and hostages made conversation. They got to know each other. The three crew members talked openly, trying their best to do or say nothing to agitate the short-tempered terrorists. At one point, Berger asked Jaggia how many children he has. I have 2 daughters. My daughter is getting married 6 days from now on New Year's Eve. In reality, Jaggia's daughters weren't even teenagers. He was lying, hoping that these micro details tugged at their hearts. The plane had now entered Afghan airspace, where ATC Kabul came online. The pilots were informed that the runway at Kabul had been tattered by bombing and that the Airbus A300 was too large to land there. Their best bet was Kandahar. But that presented its own set of problems. According to Jaggia, quote, Kandahar International Airport was still to be modernized. Its communication systems consist of just one very high frequency radio and one auto direction finder beacon to find which we were tuned into. It had neither very high frequency omni range nor the regulation instrument landing system. End quote. Despite the archaic tech though, Captain Sharan successfully landed the craft on the Soviet-built runway. Little did he know that this was the last time he would ever land or fly this plane. As the flaps opened to slow down the craft, Devi Sharan was met with the most bewildering sight. A Pajero jeep filled with Talibanis racing the aircraft in parallel. Hollywood in real life. This jeep then escorted the aircraft to its parking space. There was a sense of finality in this destination. The hijackers seemed at ease, not checking the mirrors or making impatient demands. They seemed in comfortable territory. They seemed at home. The cockpit crew was now shoved into the economy section to sit with the passengers. This was the first time in 24 hours they got to see the plight of everyone and also see all the hijackers. According to Jaggia, quote, other than Redcap, who was 5'2" and stout, there was Berger, slim, 6 feet tall and fluent in English. There was Doctor, who wore spectacles, not very tall, 5'8" or so. There was Shankar, 6'2", healthy, well-built and very fierce. He did not talk very much. Self-assured, he would always respond as a disciplined orderly does to his commanding officer in the army. And finally, Bhola, very agile, 5'7" or so, with a Kashmiri accent. He was rude to the passengers and seemed ambitious, as if determined to rise in the ranks. End quote. Christmas was uneventful. No celebrations, just a long wait at the airport in Kandahar until the authorities in India made contact. It was now 26 December. 155 people had been trapped in a metal tube for 48 hours. At this point of the hijack, an uncomfortable dynamic brewed between the hijackers and hostages, a result of Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages start liking their captor. The hijackers began making jokes about Kabuli pulao when food was sent by the Talibani authorities, and they also made conversation with the air hostesses about how Bengali women are the prettiest. Often, this friendliness was reciprocated, sometimes out of fear, other times out of submission. Now that they were holstered in economy, the pilots witnessed life as a passenger. A Canadian woman expressed disapproval at Captain Sharan. Quote, "Why do you smile when you speak to the hijackers? They want to kill you, and you laugh and joke with them?" she asked. Sharan replied, "We don't want conflict. I'm trying to build up some sort of rapport with them. If they want to kill us tomorrow, they'll think twice about it." On the other hand, the American Jean Moore marveled at their patience. Quote, "If you were American, we would all be dead. You guys are so patient and nice to the hijackers." End quote. Many fondly remember the Japanese woman on the flight. Her name was Chiaki Hisada. Jagia recounts, quote, "The Japanese woman remained completely nonchalant about the happenings around her. She was reading a Japanese language edition of Reader's Digest. After reading for a while, she would go to the toilet to change her clothes, then return to her seat and do her makeup. She repeated this in the afternoons. At night, she would again change in the toilet and come back wearing a black nightie. Reclining in her seat, she would go off to sleep. This happened for all the days that they were in Kandahar. When I asked her about it, she said, "Why should I be concerned? What has to happen, has to happen." End quote. Her stoic indifference was fuel for everyone else.
Around the very different attitudes of all the people in this situation just reminds me of something we say on our podcast a lot of times, is that you never know how someone truly reacts to stress.
Yeah.
And so we'll have cases where someone obviously seems like the criminal because they've reacted in some really odd way.
Right.
But look at this woman who's just changing her nightie. She's obviously not the hijacker, but she's falling off to sleep, doing her makeup. It's so interesting and almost heartwarming to see how humans have these very different mechanisms of coping, and good for them.
Aishwarya, in fact, the people inside the plane talk about how the response of many of the people inside the plane was incongruent to the physicality of them. So, for example, the well-built men were in tatters, they were crying, as reported. And
how interesting.
It was, I forget the name, but there was a female doctor on the plane that actually helped Rupin and Satnam and played a huge role in, taking care of the victims. So, in fact, there was also another well-built man that ended up being that sort of bad survivor character in all those Hollywood movies that nobody wanted to be around because he was blaming the pilots for what had happened. And so there was a whole bunch of characters brewing up, and you realize when you read about these real life scenarios that honestly, reality is far more convoluted than a movie can ever be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The Japanese woman might be able to afford stoicism, but the CMG at New Delhi wasn't in a position to be stoic. There was an understandable panic. If New Delhi is to open a channel of communication with the Taliban, they would be legitimizing a government they have severely condemned. Worse still, they aren't yet sure what the hijackers want exactly. At 7:30 p.m., they receive a fax from ATC Kandahar, a document from the terrorists detailing their demands. The main demand was the release of notorious terrorist Maulana Masood Azhar. Azhar was a militia separatist leader who had inspired many terrorists. He was feared and respected, and when the Indian Armed Forces caught him in 1994, he was a prized catch. Currently, he was held in maximum security at the Tihar jail in Delhi. It was hard for the CMG to believe that Afghanistan wasn't involved, but they were left with no option but to engage. For this task, New Delhi selected its two best men, MEA Joint Secretary Vivek Kajju and Intelligence Bureau official Ajit Doval. It's the same Ajit Doval who started his career as a spy and is today India's National Security Advisor. These two men had a rapport. and now it was to be put to the test. At Indira Gandhi International, they boarded an Airbus A320 with a 13-member crew, 3 medical staff, 2 engineers, and 20 disguised NSG commandos trained for anti-hijacking specifically.
The Cabinet Committee on Security met early this morning and it reviewed the situation in Kandahar. I am leaving for Kandahar to deal directly with our negotiating team and to assist the negotiating team and to establish the situation on the ground. Thank you.
At 3 p.m., they took off. Meanwhile, the cabin was stinking. 27 December had rolled by and the toilets were overflowing with urine and fecal matter. Sunlight barely entered since the windows were closed. The plane had become a living hell. The food was sparse and the same, rice with chicken and duck. And for vegetarians, only rice. The terrorists, while impatient, understood their demand would take time, and they seemed to have all the time in the world. In fact, that evening, the hijackers were in a rush for some reason. They dismantled all the cameras, ordered the passengers to put their head down and blindfolded them, and appeared more scared than the hostages themselves. Suddenly, gunshots were heard in the distance. A voice was heard. Bismillah. Someone from outside had visited the plane. Some senior Talibani official. Some say it was Osama bin Laden himself. At 2 a.m., flight engineer Anil Jagia was woken from his slumber. Water needed to be refueled, and no one at Kandahar knew how to operate an Airbus A300. While days are hot, nights in Kandahar are freezing. A cold Jagia escorted Burger and helped affix the pipe to the tank. In doing so, he sprayed himself with ice-cold water. He stood there, outside the airplane, shivering. In a reversal of roles, Burger offered Jagia his jacket. Quote, "Please wear it. It's very cold and you are all wet. You'll fall sick." End quote. He refused, but Burger insisted. "You're like my father. He's also stubborn like you. Now please wear this." Jagia said, quote, "If you call me your father, then I can't see my son without a jacket in the cold. You're wearing only a t-shirt underneath." End quote. So Burger told him to get into the car of the airport official, turn the heat to the highest, and let his captor bask in it. Was a weird inversion of Stockholm Syndrome called Lima Syndrome at play? Meanwhile, the negotiators Kajju and Doval landed in Kandahar. There was no stately welcome, just a few Talibani men awaiting the Indians in a jeep. At the airport, they meet Taliban's foreign minister Mutawakil. For Mutawakil, this whole ordeal has been a PR exercise. He has all the cards in his hands, and his goal was to alleviate Afghanistan's pariah status because the Taliban government was only officially recognized by 3 countries. Whether or not it was involved in the hijacking, the front the Taliban put was that of a neutral one. "We don't support the hijackers, but we aren't against them either," was the official line. New Delhi worked on figuring out whether releasing Masood Azhar was a tenable option. They tried finding someone who could communicate with Azhar, perhaps a former inmate at Tihar. And here's where Aishwarya, the most mind-blowing Desi crime universe crossover takes place. None other than Charles Sobraj is chosen for this task.
No
The
fucking
bikini
way.
serial killer. Azhar and Sobraj served time together at Tihar and had become quite close. According to a Rajya Sabha report from 2002 concerning overcrowding in Tihar jail, Masood Azhar was there in 1994. According to a Wire article, quote, "Azhar was unpopular at Tihar with the thieves, rapists, murderers and other patriotic Indian convicts who showed their love for their motherland by beating him to a pulp." Sobraj, who appears to have literally bought over the jail, had the Pakistani terrorists rescued, medically treated and housed in the luxury wing which he had created. They shared his meals brought in from the Delhi restaurants, end quote. Officials in Paris connected the Indian government to him and Charles Sobraj promised his help. For what it's worth, it wasn't utilized. Back in the aircraft, the hijackers had managed to access the storage area of the airplane and retrieved one of the 2 suitcases they were looking for. Now they were armed with more than guns, more grenades, and night vision goggles. The hijackers informed the negotiators that they have prepared a final list of demands, written on a piece of paper that they are dropping from the cockpit. This list included 35 jailed militants, $200 million in cash, and the coffin of martyr Sajjad Afghani. This was an absurd demand. Over the course of the next 2 days, a back and forth ensued, with Taliban's Mutawakil acting and feigning being a just mediator. India did not take the American line, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." Quite the opposite. India very much did. As a matter of foreign policy, that stance is up for debate. But for the 155 on board IC-814, those negotiations were a matter of life or death. The 155 on board IC-814 did not know what releasing Masood Azhar would cause. They did not know of the 2001 parliament attacks that he would mastermind, or the 2016 Pathankot, or the 2019 Uri attack. They did not know that he would become the founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed. To them, releasing him simply meant that they would get a chance to see their families again, a chance to walk again. And so finally, after 7 days in an aircraft overflowing with stench, a living purgatory, a deal was struck. Instead of 35 militants, 3 would be released, but all of the choice of the hijackers. They chose Masood Azhar, obviously, and 2 other jailed terrorists by the name of Ahmed Omar Sayyed and Mushtaq Ahmed Sargar. In fact, getting approval for the latter 2 from Jammu Kashmir's chief minister proved more difficult than Azhar's. CM Farouz Abdullah strongly opposed their release. Quote, Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar and Ahmed Sheikh were both connected to Harkat ul Ansar. Zargar was a dreaded terrorist and was especially notorious for his cruelty towards security forces in Kashmir. He had brutally tortured and killed many policemen and paramilitary personnel in the state. It took raw head Dulat and State Governor G.C. Saxena some time to convince Abdullah and sanction their release orders. Once sanctioned, the 3 terrorists were on their way to Kandahar.
So Aryan, these terrorists that are being negotiated over and that are about to be released, are they Afghani or are they Pakistani, with this being a show of Afghanistan and Pakistan solidarity?
Aishwarya, firstly, these terrorists are all Pakistani. So that gives you a telltale sign of who might be involved in orchestrating this attack, obviously.
Absolutely.
And as goes for the Afghanistanis' involvement, there is clearly some safe passage and some deference they have given to the Pakistani viewpoint. But in sort of playing devil's advocate for Afghanistan here, they've been much friendlier than, say, Pakistan or a UAE were, in the sense that they provided food and they're not acting the way you would assume Taliban to act. From that stereotype, they've been pretty reasonable.
To me, it's not so much the actions of Afghanistan that show their support for the terrorist, but it's the actions of the terrorists where they feel so comfortable entering Afghani airspace.
Exactly.
That is the destination they always picked. They're like happy.
Exactly. So there is clearly something in the background that's going on. In fact, they from the beginning had an Iridium phone. Iridium phones at those times were like satellite phones through which you could talk from wherever. And the pilots reported they constantly heard them talk to somebody outside. And they were always, these terrorists were always apprised of the protests taking place in India or any updates taking place in India, and they were the ones that were telling the passengers. So they were in contact with somebody on the outside, and since it was reported that they probably saw Osama bin Laden, there is that Taliban connection. Because see, at the end of the day, Taliban was an anti-India body. Osama bin Laden was clearly wanted jihad against India and America. That was something that was stated clearly in his manifesto. So, there is a lot of bad blood between the two countries. News of the deal spread like wildfire in the cabin. Captain Sharan, however, knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Things could flip any second. 30th December went by, and the final day of the millennium dawned. A year, a century, a millennium came to an end. Would their misery too come to an end, they wondered. At 3 p.m. on 31st December 1999, Berger came out of the cockpit and addressed the passengers. Quote, "I am sorry for causing you any trauma." An apology from a murderer was tough to swallow. Jagia retorted, "I hope you wouldn't cause so much trouble to so many people again." Berger said, "That's what my father used to say." Jagia also gave Berger a gift, actually. A red, ever-ready torch the hijacker had his eyes on. "Why this torch?" Berger asked. "This light will guide you to the correct path," offered flight engineer Anil Jagia as his parting words to his menacing captor. At 5:30 p.m., Masood Azhar, Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar, and Ahmed Sheikh landed in Kandahar along with Jaswant Singh. The hijackers deboarded the plane, took their prize, sat in a Pajero, and with a Talibani escort drove into the distant desert, never to be seen again. For the first time in 8 days, the passengers of flight IC 814 weren't at the mercy of 5 men. When you get so accustomed to following orders, freedom takes time to adjust. They needed someone to tell them how to leave the plane. You see, freedom is easy to forget. It was later discovered that this hijacking was concocted in Rawalpindi under the aegis of the ISI in June 1999. A group named Harkat al-Mujahideen spearheaded it. RAW and CIA had been monitoring the increased presence of Pakistani agents in Kathmandu for months. This was a grand conspiracy with failures at multiple levels. As the new millennium closed in, the hijackers and 3 freed militants drove towards Quetta and escaped into Pakistan forever. It's been nearly 25 years since this hijacking. The whereabouts of only some are known. Masood Azhar went on to form Jaish-e-Mohammed, a terror outfit that is responsible for the lives of several hundred Indian soldiers. Omar Sheikh, upon release, went back to his old ways. In fact, till date, he remains most infamous for what he did 2 years after being released. In 2002, he beheaded the Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, who was investigating the financing of Al-Qaeda. For this crime, he is currently awaiting execution in a Lahore jail. Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar began working to proliferate sleeper cells. He is suspected to be the man behind the 2019 Anantnag terror attack, which killed several CRPF jawans. The hijackers disappeared forever. They got exactly what they wanted. Got everything except justice. Justice for the hijacking of IC-814 and murder of Rupen Katyal. If it's any consolation, hijacker Zahur Mistry, alias Bhola, was gunned down on March 1st, 2022 by 2 bike-borne assailants in Karachi. Bhola was the same man that murdered Rupen. Rupen's wife Rachna was adopted by his family like their own daughter and remarried 2 years later. In a tryst of fate, she began working at Air India in 2013. In 2007, the Indian Airlines and Air India had a merger deal, and in 2011, Indian Airlines ceased all operations. This airline witnessed 16 hijackings from 1971 to 1999, one of the highest of any commercial airliner in the world. But this was all future that was yet to happen. When Captain Devi Sharan, flight engineer Anil Jagia, and co-pilot Rajinder landed in New Delhi on New Year's Day of 2000, the future was bright. The entire city had shown up at the airport to welcome its heroes back. The bravery of that crew and those passengers would forever remain etched in the nation's heart. What follows are the sounds of joyful chaos that resounded across Indira Gandhi Airport that day.
Very happy New Year to everybody. Thank you all Indians for playing all of us. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Until next time, stay safe, stay crazy, and stay desi.
If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Kadak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.